SROs are selling for close to $600. The Romeo 3 Max and 6 MOA is selling for close to $700. Delta Point Pros are going for about $450, and the Seymour RTS2B is selling for about $370. Now, Holosun is entering the market with the 507 comp at just $370, where you can pick your own reticle. Welcome back to the Humble Marksman channel, the only gun channel on the internet that's dripping with that BDE. That's right, Big Dad Energy. When does a joke become a dad joke? When it becomes apparent. Sound off in the comments with your favorite dad joke, and if it's awesome, I might just use it. I'm David, and this is the Holosun 507 comp. Special thanks to Optics Planet for help making this video possible. If you pretend like you fall asleep at your keyboard and just use code HUMM, you might save 7%. So thank you to our friends at Optics Planet. Before we get started looking at this, I do need to lay a little bit of groundwork on theory on how you use a red dot, the features that make a competition red dot desirable, my opinion of how the dot performs, and then how it stacks up in the market segment. Because if I don't lay kind of a groundwork, we're gonna have a non-productive argument in the comments. So I'll just kind of spell out kind of how we use these dots. So the way that the comments usually go on this is I'll make the bold claim that, you know, a 6 MOA dot is the best or something like that. And then you guys in the comments are like, no way, my 1 MOA is superior and all that kind of stuff. And I realize the reason why we have that argument is because there's two types of shooters, and this is not an elitist comment, just bear with me. There's the people who shoot slow at square ranges, and they tend to favor smaller dots because they think that they're getting more of the precision from aiming. And then there's people who shoot dynamically who realize that you can't get at that precision for aiming, and one thing you can get at with a bigger dot is it's easier to call shots on target. Calling a shot means that as you're pulling the trigger, the dot is going to be moving around. It's eventually going to jump to some point and then jump straight up out of the window. That's where your shot is going to go on target if you've got a good zero. People who know how to call shots tend to prefer bigger dots because the bigger dot is visible throughout the movement and it's easier to see where the shots are going. But there is kind of a diminishing returns curve. There's a size at which it becomes too distracting and too difficult to understand where the shot is going on target, or you're potentially degrading your ability to aim precisely a little bit too much. The good news is that number of where the fall off happens to occur is probably north of 12 MOA. 20 might be too big, but you can easily do a 10 out to like 30 or even 50 yards. So if you're one of the people whose experience with red dot shooting is predominantly slow fire on a square range and you've got strong opinions on the fine dot, that's fine. That's not what this dot necessarily is for. It says it's a competition dot right in the title. So the larger reticles make more sense to competition shooters who shoot dynamically. And to that point, the Holosun 507 comp comes with 4 different reticle options that you can combine into like a million different permutations. It's got a 2 MOA dot, but then it's got 4 circles. It's got an 8, a 20, and a 32. I guess not 4 circles, 3 circles, 4 total reticles. And then there's combinations of sort of all of the above. But how useful is it to have all of those reticles? Is it truly an advantage for the shooter, or is it something that just makes it easier for them to hit a cost point because they don't have to make multiple SKUs? Because if there are multiple reticles loaded into the dot, then they don't have to make like 3 versions of the sight. They can just make 1 version and the user can select their own reticle. So to test this practically, I set up just a basic array of 3 open US PSA targets, and I shot them at 3 different distances, 7, 15, and 22 yards. Simple from the holster, 2 on each, and just observing what I saw as I was shooting. I tried the 2 MOA dot at 7 yards and immediately discarded it. When you're shooting fast, the 2 MOA dot washes out on the target very quickly unless you use a ton of brightness. It makes it very difficult to see in sort of a flash sight picture where that dot is at. The 2-8 combo is way more observable. You don't have to use nearly as much brightness, and that's all to the good, because a lot of us, myself included, have an astigmatism, and what aggravates an astigmatism is a very bright dot. So the people who say if you have a fine dot, you can bloom it and it appears larger. If you've got an astigmatism, that's not a winning solution, because all that means is the dot becomes like way more distorted, and we want to see that kind of that round circle as opposed to like comet tails coming out at 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock or whatever it is. So really a solution, if you're trying to observe the dot as it's moving and lifting, would be a larger reticle with less brightness. At that 7 yard line, I found that the 8 MOA circle was usable. The combo of the 20 MOA circle and the 2 MOA dot was usable. Even the 32 MOA and the dot was usable. And the reason we're talking about how the dot is observable and not using it as an aiming device is because when you're shooting fast and practically like that, the transition is done with your eyes. You're moving your eyes as the shot breaks to the next target. Wherever your eyes happen to land, the dot is going to land within close proximity to where your eyes land on that target. So if you transition your eyes outside of the A zone, that's where the hits are generally going to show up. You're not necessarily aiming unless you're slowing down and pulling it back to center. You're just ballistically throwing your eyes from target to target, which is why the bigger dot is more of an advantage, because it's more obvious where the landing is, so you can call the shot as you fire. If you want to clean up your hits, then it's going to be through practice and transitioning your eyes. It's not necessarily anything to do with the dot. Moving back to 15, pretty much immediately the 32 MOA circle becomes irrelevant. The 32 MOA and the 8 and the 2 MOA is also kind of too much information, and if you use too much brightness, it just floods you with information with where the dot is on target. It becomes very difficult to see where the dot is lifting from. It's 333. It's busier. I don't think at 15 yards, the 20 MOA circle provides any value. I think it's a distraction. Moving back to 22 yards, similarly, I found that the 2 and 8 was my preferred reticle. The 2 and 20 actually was usable. It's way more usable. The 32 and the 2 is just terrible. Let's talk about those multiple reticles and what's kind of going on with that. So you've got those 13 or so permutations that you have, but how much does it really matter? So talking about that 7, 15, and 22 yard pictures, the 2 MOA dot, I mean, it basically doesn't even quite get to a paster size at 25 yards. It's just difficult to observe, as we've discussed. Getting onto the 8 MOA circle at 7 yards, it's roughly the size of a paster. At 15 yards, it's going to be bigger than a paster. It basically is almost like, you know, a paster and a half. At 22 yards, it's like 2 or 3 pasters or so, which for a dynamic sight picture is pretty good. Now jumping up to the 20, at 7 yards, the 20 is already nearly 2 pasters around there. It's pretty big. Ignore the big circle because I'm not a good artist. At 15 yards, the circle is much bigger. It's like 3 or so pasters wide. At 22 yards, it basically fills just the inside of the head box inside the perforation on a USPSA target. Now let's talk about that 32 MOA ring. 32 MOA at 7 roughly is about half the head box or so, is the way it appears to my eyes anyway. At 15 yards, it fills the head box entirely. And at 22 yards, it blows out the head box. It's wider than the C zone. So it's just too much. Like, it's just too much information, and you can't really use it to aim at that point. It's only good for locating your dot inside the window somewhere. So it's good for finding your dot, but it's not good to aim with or call shots with. Now, let's talk about kind of the features that sort of make a dot good for competition. First and foremost, there is the size of the window. That matters when you're going to be shooting, you know, strong hand only or support hand only. The dot's going to kind of move all around. The bigger the window is, the easier it is to keep track of where the dot is, and you can return the dot to the center of the target. The clarity of the glass, the color of the glass, the dot emitter's brightness, that's actually really important. Brightness is actually really important because most competitions take place in the summer sun. So you need a dot that can keep up with, you know, the brightness of the sun effectively. There is the deck height. That's going to be the thickness of the housing as it comes off the slide sort of there. The lower you can get the window and the dot to the top of the slide, the more intuitive it's going to be to aim with. It's going to be more like aiming iron sights. There's button quality, and then there's kind of like batteries are kind of not that important because with competition dots, we change batteries a lot. It has a very large window. It has plenty bright emitters. The glass is mostly clear, but it has a decent amount of distortion. It's not as bad as like the 507 type regular C optics. The buttons are kind of undersized, but they're pretty good quality. I haven't broken any buttons on a Holosun. The deck height is pretty minimal. It's actually quite a good deck height. It's very low. There is no solar failsafe on the 507 comp, which is kind of a gimmick feature anyway, so nobody, I think, really misses that. There's a couple things about this optic you're going to want to know about. The SRO has a problem where if you're shooting into the sun at either sunrise or sunset, there's a ghost dot that appears that is actually bright enough to be mistaken for the true reticle. This does get some ghost dot, but not that much. Like, you can tell that there's a reflection and there's like red stuff, but it doesn't appear illuminated like the dot. It's impossible to mistake it for the aiming device, but you know, there is some sort of reflection off the emitter window onto the glass. Now, another consideration for a dot is if you find yourself on the range, this will take tool adjustments. You're gonna have to use the standard Holosun type key to dial in your windage and elevation adjustments. Not the end of the world, but with the SROs, it's a little bit nicer when you have the brass case that you can adjust the optic with. Looking at the SRO has a window size that is big but circular and narrower at the bottom. The glass has kind of a green tint and it has a pretty pronounced fisheye effect. Brightness is plenty bright, however the reticle size only goes up to 5 MOA. The buttons kind of suck on it. They're very hard and very difficult to manipulate, like you basically hurt the pads of your thumbs trying to squeeze the darn things. The durability is amazing. They basically don't break. I haven't broken one yet anyway. And the deck height is about the same as the Holosun, which is to the good. The Delta Point Pro has a window size that's roughly the same size. It's a little bit smaller than the 507 comp. The brightness is pretty bright on the 6. The 2.5, it kind of washes out on a full sun day. The deck height is pretty tall. It gets the glass pretty high above the slide. It only has one button, which kind of sucks, and this is in a really unfortunate place, so cycling through the brightness settings on the Delta Point Pro kind of sucks. I have broken that button and had to send it back to Loophole before, so there you go. Moving on to the RTS2B, which costs the same as the 507 comp. The window is smaller and rounder. The dot is very, very bright, but will not dim down to the point that it is usable for indoor applications. It's gonna bloom way too much, especially if you have an astigmatism. The low setting on the RTS2B is just too bright. It can also make group shooting on overcast days a little bit too challenging. The button quality on the RTS2B is kind of dodgy. I've managed to break the buttons on that, had to send it back. Warranty work was acceptable from Seymour. The glass is pretty clear, there is almost no distortion, and the crispness of the dot is very good. The reticle is quite nice. And finishing up with the SIG Romeo 3 Max, which is the most expensive dot in the segment. The deck height is very, very tall. It was originally a rifle sight that Max Michel claimed as his pistol sight. The window is huge, it's taller, but it doesn't go up in the corners. Whether that's a value on the 507 comp, I guess I don't know. But the glass has basically zero distortion, but a slight kind of blue-green tint to it. The crispness of the dot is fantastic, available in both 3 and 6 MOA. And the button quality on the SIG, I've got two of the things. One of them's been going strong, no problems. The other one feels like the buttons are getting ready to go, and from what I understand, when they fail, that's usually how they fail. But I'm gonna pick along with it. We'll see at the end of the season if I need to send it in or not. So for $370, yeah, the Holosun is good enough in all of the categories to make it a very obvious choice. Like, is it such a sight that you're gonna wanna run out and replace any of those dots that I just mentioned? I would say probably not, unless you absolutely hate the reticle that's on your sight and you wanna use the 2/8 circle reticle. Now the 8 MOA circle reticle on this, it looks bigger than an 8 MOA. When I compare it to the RTS2 and 10 MOA, this dot appears bigger to my eyes anyway. So I don't think it's a true 8, I think it's kind of larger, which is okay for practical shooting, honestly. It's not too bad. I mean, I shot the thing out to about 40 yards, this dot, and I wasn't having issues hitting with, you know, a 40-yard shot with the 8 MOA circle. So is the multi-reticle system kind of a boon to the end user, or is it just a feature so that they can hit a cost point because they're not having to make 3 SKUs for their competition site? I think it's more in the first camp, but I do think there is advantage to the end user as a result of being able to pick your reticle. The first reason why is it's very common for when people first get into kind of like the practical shooting side of the house, they pick a dot that's way too small and they realize why small dots don't work as well in dynamic environments, then they have to go buy a new optic. So if people were to buy this optic and get into the game, then they can, you know, start with the 2 MOA dot, realize that's way too small, and then use the larger dots and have a good time without having to buy a new optic. I think that's a win. The other side where the 2 MOA dot is a really big advantage is when you're getting a 0. You're able to get a very precise 0 using the 2 MOA dot only, and that's when the 2 MOA dot really shines, is like extreme distance shooting, like 100 yards and beyond. The 2 MOA dot is an asset to have, but those kinds of shots almost never appear in a shooting contest. So like, it's guys who like, when I'm out on the farm, I like to shoot over 100 yards. Like, okay, well in your application, 2 MOA makes sense, but for a typical pistol racer, 2 MOA doesn't make sense. But by having the 2 MOA, you've got the ability to get a very precise 0, which is to the good. The 20 MOA and the 32 MOA circles, I think they're just more gimmick than they are useful. There may be those of you out there, maybe I don't understand how to use them. Sound off in the comments and let me know how I am misguided in that regard, but I suspect Most people are just going to use the 2 dot turned on with the 8 circle, and that's going to be how this sight lives. So anyway, sound off in the comments. What is your preferred reticle, or what would you use rather than this? Are you going to replace your electronic sight on your pistol with one of these things? Let me know. As always, I appreciate you guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.